Yeah, I mean it's just a dramatic result. I mean, you can turn aggression on at the flip of a switch. You can turn aggression off when it's happening naturally. You're doing it by manipulating this particular population of neurons in the hypothalamus that is marked by its expression of one of the estrogen receptors in the brain, and it's different from other neurons that are right next to it in the hypothalamus that are involved in other behaviors. I want to talk a little bit about the significance of the estrogen receptor here as a marker for these neurons. If I try and, if we when we speak in everyday speech, people often reference hormones. They'll say things like, teenagers are filled with hormones, and this is why they do crazy things or take high risk behaviors or erratic. They might reference, a woman who is going through a pregnancy or different phases of her menstrual cycle, and that her behavior is quote unquote due to hormones. But what exactly are hormones? And how do they work to influence our behavior? And why is the hypothalamus sort of a very important brain structure for connecting those dots?
Right. Those are great and very important questions. So hormones are a type of chemical that circulates in our bodies, and they can come in different classes or different forms. People have probably heard of steroids. There's a group of steroid hormones, and then there are also peptide hormones. So insulin is an example of a peptide hormone, and estrogen and testosterone are examples of steroid hormones. What these hormones do in the case of the steroid hormones is that they're able to cross the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain. And then some of the cells in the brain, like the ones that express the estrogen receptor, what that receptor is a protein molecule in that neuron that is a docking site for the hormone. So the hormone goes into lots of different cells. It crosses their membrane and it goes into the cell. And if the cell isn't expressing the right receptor, the hormone doesn't do anything. It just hangs around until it gets degraded or it goes back out of the cell. But if the cell has the receptor for the hormone docks to the receptor, sort of like the little space shuttle docking with the space station at the beginning of 2001. And then the space station, which is the hormone receptor, turns on or turns off many genes in that same cell. And the turning on or off of those genes can make that cell more active, less active. It can make it grow. It can make it shrink. It can even make it survive and prevent it from dying, or in some cases, it could kill it. So these hormones are extremely powerful because they affect very specific groups of neurons in the brain. And the effects that they have on those neurons are very profound in the way they're able to shape the activity of those neurons and therefore affect the behavior those neurons control.
So hormones are literally going through the bloodstream into the brain and directly affecting neurons in various ways.
That's right.
And was it surprising that the estrogen receptor, an estrogen receptor, was the marker you found for these aggression neurons?
In retrospect, it shouldn't have been surprising had we been more sophisticated in our knowledge of this region of the brain. But like many people in the lay community, we assumed that if any steroid hormone has something to do with aggression, it must be testosterone. We assume that testosterone is the male hormone. When you have more testosterone, you're more aggressive, and estrogen is the female hormone. And if anything, it should make females less aggressive so that they can mate and take care of their young and offspring and raise them. So estrogen is responsible for all the good things that animals do and people, and testosterone is responsible for all the bad things that people do. And it turns out that that's way too simplistic. And it's been known for decades that even in males, the a lot of the actions of testosterone are mediated not through its own receptor, which is called the androgen receptor. It's a receptor in that binds to testosterone, but testosterone can also be chemically converted in the brain to estrogen in a very simple chemical reaction. And then the estrogen can bind to the estrogen receptor and exert particular effects. So, for example, it's been known that if you surgically castrate a rodent, a male, it will lose the ability to fight. And of course, if you give it back testosterone, it'll regain the ability to fight. But you can also give it back the ability to fight by giving it estrogen instead of testosterone, because you're just bypassing the requirement for the brain to convert the testosterone into estrogen. So estrogen is very important for and this is not all our work. This is work in many labs, including Nirav Shah, who's a former student of mine now at Stanford. Estrogen, somewhat paradoxically, plays a key role in masculinizing the mammalian brain. It's released shortly after birth in a peak, and that release of estrogen is critical to set up the circuits in the male brain that control specific behaviors and male aggression. And then others have shown that in the adult even, estrogen receptor in this region of the hypothalamus is necessary for mice to fight. If you genetically knock out that estrogen receptor in that region of the hypothalamus, the animals don't fight. So you need the estrogen both developmentally in order to construct a masculinized nervous system, and you also need it functionally in the adult to allow those neurons to function correctly in aggression. And conversely, in females, it's been known since the late 70s from work from Donald Pfaff that in the region of the female brain, the analogous region of the female brain, there are cells that control mating behavior that also have the estrogen receptor in them. But there are different kind of neuron from the neurons that control aggression, as we and others have recently shown. So even in the same brain region, there are not only in one sex some neurons that respond to estrogen and some that don't, but if you compare the two sexes, males and females, there are different kinds of estrogen responsive neurons in the female brain and in the male brain.
Mm-hmm. And, one thing that I think that strikes me here about hormones is they are probably not only controlling neurons like the ones you just described in order to affect behaviors like this, but I imagine they're also coordinating physiological processes throughout the body. So, for example, when the aggressive mouse gets aggressive, it needs to have the motor output of aggression that we're watching in the video, but it also needs to be sending more blood flow to its muscles. It probably needs to have its pupils dilated, things like this. So are hormones acting, to what extent are they acting locally versus sort of globally throughout different tissues to coordinate all of these different systems?
So there's definitely actions of the sex steroids outside the brain. For example, testosterone builds muscle tissue. That's why weightlifters often take testosterone to do that. And by the way, when they do that, they often develop female secondary sex characteristics like breasts. And that's because they're taking all this testosterone and a lot of it is getting converted into estrogen, and estrogen makes breast cells grow in males as well as in females. So those weightlifters also take aromatase inhibitors, which are drugs that prevent testosterone from being converted into estrogen so that they can have big muscles and no breasts. And that indicates this intimate relationship between these two sex steroids, testosterone and estrogen, and the fact that we have drugs that can block this conversion. So yes, there are effects of these hormones in the body on tissues like muscle tissue, breast tissue, and there are also indirect effects. You mentioned pupil dilation, heart rate, those sorts of things, functions are mainly attributed to so-called fight or flight hormones like adrenaline, which are released from the brain and also from the body during conditions where the animal is stressed. And they're released from a type of neurons called sympathetic neurons that are outside of the brain and the spinal cord, but which get input from the brain, including from the hypothalamus and the regions of the hypothalamus that are sensitive to estrogen. So this is a way that estrogen acting on cells in the brain can affect cells outside the brain that release fight or flight hormones like epinephrine, adrenaline, that can make your heart beat faster, increase your blood circulation, make your pupils dilate, and do all of the other things that you need to do if you're fighting or fleeing.